All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Youth Sexting, a webinar for educators, caregivers, and researchers. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. And if you have any questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A function. It's a box that's located in the bottom center of your Zoom Windows taskbar. The chat box is also available if you have any comments, if you want to participate along the way, compliments for our wonderful presenter today, or technical support questions during the presentation. My name is Savannah Holt. I'm a Sexual and Reproductive Health Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. The Prevention Institute is a provincial nonprofit organization that's located in Saskatoon and Treaty Lands 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We affirm our commitment to reconciliation through our work with the communities that we serve. Our organizational focus is to reduce disabling conditions in children using primary prevention methods. We raise awareness by providing training, information, and resources based on current best evidence. We believe that all children, regardless of ability, have the right to the best physical, social, and emotional health possible. We work in a variety of areas, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, maternal and infant health, early childhood mental health, child injury prevention, child traffic safety, parenting, and sexual and reproductive health. One focus of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Program is to provide evidence-based information on topics related to youth sexual health that is responsive to community identified needs, and the rise and popularity of texting and various messaging apps certainly fits that need right now. So sexting has become a phenomenon that youth and adults who support them are very curious and concerned about. And here to speak on this topic today is health researcher, Dr. Lindsay Williamson. Dr. Lindsay Williamson is dedicated to helping people improve their relationships with humans and animals. And at present, she is a Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CIHR funded postdoctoral researcher and credentialed evaluator who examines various aspects of human-animal interactions. Lindsay has also conducted research on abortion, sexual consent, the Me Too movement, infertility, feminist identification, and sex education, which have been published in the Canadian Journal of Sexual Health, Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology Canada, and Journal of Reproductive and Infant Psychology. Her contributions to the sexual health community have included volunteering with Planned Parenthood Waterloo Region, now the Shore Centre, Planned Parenthood Toronto, Saskatoon Sexual Health, Saskatoon Sexual Assault and Information Center, and Ness Creek Music Festival's Safe Haven, as well as serving as interim executive director and board member for Saskatoon Sexual Health. She's also taught human sexuality for the Department of Psychology at the University of Saskatchewan. As a consultant for the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute since 2014, Lindsay has produced over 15 technical reports and helped establish the adolescent sexual health community of practice. Outside of research, evaluation, and teaching, Lindsay trains her beloved Australian cattle dog, Steve Irwin. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lindsay.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. So let me get my screen all set up here for you. Okay, there we go. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. So yeah, I am joining you from my home in Meaford, Ontario. So I'm gonna say right now, I'm at home with my dog, Steve. So if he ends up barking or anything like that, yes, Steve Irwin, named after the beloved Steve Irwin, absolutely. If he barks at something, I apologize in advance, but that's kind of one of the joys and drawbacks of working from home. So, all right, so yeah, really excited to talk to you about this topic today. It's something that I have been very immersed in for the last year with a couple of reports that I'll talk about for the Prevention Institute. So before we get into that, I like to do a reflexivity practice because I think that it's really important for everybody to know kind of where I was coming from in terms of the perspectives that I bring to reading the literature and interpreting it as well, and just generally like my life views. So I think engaging in this practice allows people to decide, do you, if you appreciate that information, or if you maybe need different voices, to tell you, about what's going on, or to have it make sense for you. So I will absolutely try my best to be as transparent and open, and always open to changing as well, and learning from you. It's something I really, emphasize when I'm teaching at all levels, is that I know a lot, and I've really devoted a lot of my time to understanding the different topics that I've engaged in. But I know that I have so much to learn. I feel like I'm a lifelong student, and I love learning from other people as well. So please, I invite you to put any thoughts or ideas into the chat, and connect afterwards if you're interested in talking more about this. So this presentation has been developed with these two reports in mind. So the first report that I completed last year for the Prevention Institute was an environmental scan looking at the various online resources around sexting that are available. So I looked at resources on a global level. So I looked at from various countries, again, limited in the sense that I only speak English, so I couldn't look at all of them, but that are available. So I did my best to see, just get a snapshot of what's going on, and not just what's out there, but what are the messages being shared? What are the key underlying meanings that people are making around sexting? And in particular, how are they making the meaning for various groups? So for youth themselves, and for, parents or caregivers and educators and researchers as well. So following the environmental scan, I completed a literature review. It ended up being a critical review, though, in the sense that once I dove into this literature, I realized that it is far from perfect, quite divided, and there are gaps. So something that I want to invite you all to kind of think about as we're going through this presentation is, what are some of the gaps that you see, and within the world of sexting research and intervention and prevention, and what are your ideas? What do you think we should, not just what we should study, but what should we do about it, right? And how should we go about examining these topics and making meaning and connecting with other people about this information? So these are, I think Savannah had put these report links in the chat, so feel free to check them out, but I am going to summarize them for you. So if you don't want to or don't have the time to read, that's fine. You're going to get a lot of the information in this presentation here. All right, so the learning objectives for today are really to give you a clearer understanding of what sexting is, why it's important, especially when we're talking about it within the context of youth. What are some of the potential risks and outcomes, and even benefits? I try to have a more balanced perspective. I don't want to see it just one way. I want to look at all of the ways that we can, kind of consider this topic. I do want to get into some of the laws around sexting and give you not just a snapshot, but also a bit of a critique around them as well. I think this is an area where a lot more work needs to be done. And I'm going to highlight throughout, the various ways that people look at sexting. So there's divided camps for sure. It's not everybody looks at it and feels the same way about it. And then I want to give some more practical information around what can we do about it? How can we help youth? And even how can we help ourselves? Because I don't think I'm any longer, I'm definitely not in the youth category anymore. I think I aged out of that a few years ago. But, it's still something that myself and friends of mine, they're still engaging in sexting. They're still experiencing some of the benefits and potential drawbacks of it as well. So in terms of the laws that I refer to, they are federal. So I will get into that. Thank you. All right, so sexting isn't new, but the ways that we sext, the ways that we connect, the ways that we entice are changing for sure. But there is definitely a long history of people wanting to, engage in this type of communication. So writing letters, sending pictures, this isn't a new thing. I was thinking about this morning. There was definitely so many times when I was growing up that, trying to send little notes in class or sneak a note into somebody's locker, or pictures, just to entice. I absolutely engaged in that growing up. And there were definitely some ways that it came back to bite me in the sense that, there were lots of times that those letters and notes were shared publicly. And I remember being embarrassed about it. So, and that was well before cell phones, were on the scene. So I definitely want us all to keep that in perspective, that it's not necessarily the sexting or the texting or the communication itself. It's some of the ways that this interacts with the technology that is problematic, and also when we get into issues around consent. So that's definitely going to be a theme throughout this, is that interplay between this type of communication and whether or not everybody's absolutely on board with the way that it unfolds and the way that it can be shared. So technology, yeah, whether we like it or not, it is here and it's just going to keep growing. And I think that there's lots of good that comes with it, in the sense that, our ability to communicate and connect with others the world over is incredible. I can't, I can't say that it's always perfect in the sense, but it's just something that we've not really had this at this level before. So being able to have that is excellent. In some ways, having that information and the data stored, whether it's in a cloud or a hard drive somewhere, that information is accessible, and it's there for us to get whenever we want it. There's lots of features that allow us to do all of this very safely, and to make sure that we can do it in a way that actually, is important and meaningful to us, and it allows us to really truly express who we are as individuals. But of course, the not so great about this is that, yeah, even though we have all of this information, yeah, sure, most of it just sits and nobody does anything with it. Absolutely. But there are those instances where people do share the information, and they do it without consent, and they do it in a malicious way. They do it to trick people. They do it to coerce them. They do it to, just hurt them in different ways. And that is where the technology is far from perfect, right? Because there are times where the way that it's used is not, for the good. So in looking at, I think we all have a general understanding of what sexting might be. And I had hoped to find, a very comprehensive, definition within the research literature, and I did not. So in fact, I remember talking about that with Savannah, in the sense that I actually wasn't sure how to make sense of some of the literature, because there were so many different ideas about what it is. And that tells you a couple of things. One, it's not necessarily that, these are top scientists. They're really capable and smart. It's not about that. It's just, this is a contentious issue. There is division in terms of how people see it. Researchers bring bias to the table, right? So that's where you can see that, that division in terms of those beliefs and those values that people bring to the table. And do they want sexting to be seen as something that is really good for people, or do they want people to see it as something to be alarmed about and to stay away from? The other thing that this kind of tells you is that this area of literature is very much in its infancy. It is just getting started. I don't doubt that it'll continue to grow, given the rise of technology, given the changing landscape of dating and connecting with people in sexual and romantic ways as well. So it's definitely here to stay, but I think that there's lots of room within the research literature for improvements. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can see what sexting is, but really the way that I'm going to conceptualize it is, we're talking about text, we're talking about photos or images, videos, snaps, memes, all of those. They're all about the intent to entice, about the intent sorry, I got distracted by the chat because it was really interesting. It's all about, really a romantic sexual undertone to it. And some of the information might be simply a word or a phrase. It could be a particular photo or meme. It could be emojis as well, or emoticons, which I just learned the difference of. So sorry. So yeah, so I'm going to kind of keep within that simplified version of it. There's definitely more within the literature looking at the definition in terms of risk and responsibility as well. So I'll kind of talk more about those nuances as we go through. But first, let's play a game. Let's use the chat. I would love to find out how you all are familiar with these images. So these are emojis, and these are common emojis and combinations of emojis that people might use to convey a particular meaning. And again, could be sexual, could be not. Again, a lot of these are just pretty innocuous. An eggplant is an eggplant, but it's also something else if we all decide, and if we all agree, and if we all are on the same page and decide, okay, eggplant is also something else. So yeah, I would love for you to, just share and let me know kind of what you think some of these might mean. So I can see, yes, I don't know if I'm proud or ashamed to know them. I don't think you should be ashamed at all. Yeah, number one, no idea, except the eggplant might be a penis. Yes, I would say that generally people look at the eggplant as a penis, yes. Yeah, this volcano explosion, fireworks, rockets going off. Yeah, I generally we see those images as the big finale. I love how in older movies they didn't necessarily want to always show that they were having sex, but then they would use these symbols, to kind of indicate that that's exactly what was happening. So yeah, so the camel, I kind of love this. So this is a combination of an emoji and a couple of letters as well. And with that, we have humping. Hopefully you got that one too. Yep. Yeah, this one down here, birds, bees, talking about sex. So yeah, again, I would say that there's probably going to be some conventional ideas about what these mean. And then there's going to be more of the niche kind of ideas. A lot of times people try to take what used to be used in one way and redefine it as well. So don't feel like you have to understand what all of these are, because very likely they're going to change, and they'll change within the context as well. So you're not always going to, use them in the same way or with the same people in the same way. So there's definitely going to be some variation. But yeah, so again, with texting, this is sometimes what you'll get. It's not always words. So I want to go into a little bit about the kind of two main camps within the literature, and this is within more mainstream literature and then the research literature as well. So the first perspective is what you could call more of the deviancy perspective, where they look at sexting as or the way that sexting is framed is something that's risky, something that's inherently dangerous, something that should be approached with caution or even avoided altogether. So some people will, kind of really push for abstinence. And, in a lot of ways, this perspective is understandable, especially as we talk about some of the potential outcomes and drawbacks that come with sexting. Yes, absolutely. This is understandable. I get why people are nervous about it, especially when you hear about people, being harmed, because of sexting, because of somebody sharing it without consent or sharing it and then feeling bullied by other people as a result. And especially when we are in a situation of talking about youth, right? We're talking about youth who are in schools where, bullying of all kinds can take place in person and also online. So more cyberbullying, that we're kind of understanding it as right now. So yes, and there's also a lot of overlap, I would say, with sexting literature and looking at exploitation of youth. So a lot of times there will be grooming behavior that involves sexting, whether it's in a chat room or if somebody has exchanged, cell phone or social media information. A lot of groomers will use sexting as a means to groom and coerce their potential victims. So there is some overlap there with this literature, again, looking at it as, a place of, sexting could be harmful. Also, when we think about youth, we also think about the peer pressure to engage. And sometimes people will engage not necessarily understanding all of the potential risks and outcomes that come with it. So I think that, being able to recognize all of this is important, but there is another side as well. And that other side is kind of more of this normalcy perspective. And by normal, it's not necessarily, again, sometimes I'm not really a fan of that term, because normal is always in relation to something that's abnormal or what's common, and that's there's so much variety within it. But the normalcy perspective is more that, looking at sexting as a very common part of growing up for youth, of connecting, of, expressing themselves in a sexual way. Sometimes for some people, it's kind of the only way that they can connect, whether it's because of distance, because of anxiety, because of, just needing, to feel more confident behind a screen rather than being face to face with somebody. Sometimes being able to engage in sexting can be an act of, not just self-expression, but also agency, because you have things that are in your power. You can decide how and what you say to somebody. You can also decide how and when and how, and what you say to somebody in response. If any of you have ever been left on red, that is somebody, just either being distracted and not getting back to you right away, or they're deciding for themselves that they want to take the time to get back to you and respond to you in a particular way. So I think that taking a normalcy perspective, especially when we link this back to the larger conversation about sex education, taking a normalcy perspective is really a big part of being sex positive and also being comprehensive. I would add, though, that if you want to be comprehensive in your education, you do have to talk about the other side as well, which is why I do kind of bring in that other more deviancy perspective as well, so that we understand where we're all coming from. And I don't want to judge. I don't want to judge the person who takes a deviancy perspective. I don't want to judge the person who takes a normalcy perspective. I want to look at what both of them have to say, find ways to come to some kind of agreement, find a way to be on the same page, especially when we probably all want the same things at the end, which is for people to do things safely. So a little bit more in terms of, looking into the literature. There's so many different ways that, not just looking at the broader perspectives, but people researchers in particular, so sorry, we love to have categories. And sometimes categories are great. I think about it from a statistical point of view. If I'm running statistical analyses, having categories makes things a lot easier. But categories can also, make people feel like they're in a box and not really fully understood or not able to fully express themselves. So, there's definitely some drawbacks with having categories, but I think, as humans, not even just as researchers, just as humans, we love to make meaning. We love to have labels. We love to have different identities as well, because it really does help us have shared understanding and meaning between one another. So these are some of the ways that you can kind of look at sexting. And again, some of these will come, they're really inspired or coming from those different perspectives. So you can see that we might think of sexting as a moral issue. So talking about it in terms of being good or bad. We can also look at whether it's primary or secondary. So primary would be the content that an individual creates themselves, whereas secondary would be that, the forwarding of information with permission or without. That's really, part of the caveat there. And there's also, I think this is coming from the more alarmist kind of perspective, but there is sexting that is more aggravated and vengeful in a lot of ways. And that, kind of goes more into that criminal place. But there are also people who, and as we'll get into some of the laws around sexting, which again, it's far from perfect, but a lot of times, these categories will be used to help understand, how to make sense of where the laws fit into that. So if somebody is engaging in sexting for the purposes of exploitation versus self-expression, if they're doing consensually versus non-consensually, all of this will make a difference in terms of, whether or not there's going to be negative outcomes or whether it's going to be more passive or even positive. So sexting among youth, quite common. So this is a US sample. I really wish I could have found a Canadian one, but this is a 2020 set of data that looked at, different age groups, different sex categories as well, and looking at, whether people were sending sext or whether they were receiving them. And it seems that overwhelmingly people are receiving them a lot more than they're sending them. And something that I really have to, kind of question is, so in terms of receiving, are they getting it consensually? Is somebody asking them beforehand, hey, would it be cool if I sent you this, whether it's text or whether it's an image? So I think that that's a huge, kind of flag that I might raise, and looking at, if I was just looking at this graph, on its own without reading the rest of the article, I might be concerned about that. And same with the people that are sending, and what are their reasons for sending? I want to know why they feel this, because it could be because of pressure. It could be because they're in a relationship and they're trying to, connect with their partner. Maybe they're trying to entice somebody and they think that the only way that they can, get that person's interest is if they engage in this behavior. So these are, some of the additional questions that I might bring up, when I'm looking at this type of data. But overall, yes, this is definitely something to, I'm not going to say, I was going to say worry about, but I don't want to say that. I want to say that this is something for us to keep in mind, that, it's not going away. It seems to be increasing from a lot of the data that I looked at. And the reasons behind it, again, so varied. So we've kind of touched on this in terms of some of the reasons, but self-expression, experimentation, this is a huge part of, development within, a youth's experience. So as they are, learning to connect with people that they might be interested in romantically or sexually, sometimes just for fun as well, this is a great way for them to be able to do that. They can do it in a private way. They can do it in a way that doesn't make them feel so awkward. There is the opportunity to kind of manage the way that we present ourselves online in a way that's very different than in person as well, which, I think could be good. I see the good, but there's the drawback too, that if you are only engaging online, are you truly being yourself? I think about that a lot, in terms of, because we have that ability to, really edit and refine what we send to people, when we're responding via text or email, is that, authentic. So I think that's something for youth to understand, or kind of consider as well, and for us as caregivers and educators, for us to consider too, because the reasons for people engaging can really help us understand their level of risk, and also help kind of target our interventions, and whether we're trying to be more preventative or if we're trying to help people afterwards as well. So some of the more questionable reasons, and again, potentially harmful reasons that people engage in sexting, definitely. And I would say that this is maybe, I think some people might try to say that this is isolated to youth, but I would say that, in general, people can feel pressured. They can feel like engaging in this behavior is what's going to get them popularity. It's what's going to get them that date. It's what's going to get them that relationship or that respect that they might be looking for. But doing things just because you think other people are doing it, we all know that, it's not necessarily the way to go. We really do need to be true to ourselves, but that's hard. That's really hard when you're growing up and you don't really know who you are and you're trying to find yourself. So you try on different things. And for a lot of people, they'll try things out, they'll be experimental and nothing will come of it in terms of, negative outcomes. But the problem is that there is the risk for negative outcomes. And that's what youth need to be made aware of and be able to help manage and prevent for themselves, especially when we get into issues of exploitation. So whether that's, a peer, or whether it's, a total stranger, or, an adult in their life that is trying to groom them, that is something that they need to be aware of as well. But even their peers, or even former lovers and partners, sometimes they might engage in things out of hurt, and to be vengeful, and for a whole other host of reasons. They might decide to use the information that you shared within the context of intimacy against you. So I think that in considering this, again, these are what can help guide us for various research questions that we might want to explore, as well as interventions and programs that we might want to develop. So let's talk about some of the risks. So the biggest one, and again, this is part of the awesome thing and the really bad thing about technology, is that the sex that we send, whether they're texts, whether they're emojis, whether they're images, they can be shared. They can be shared so quickly and easily. I think about just sharing with colleagues and friends, if all of a sudden we see a meme or we see a photo, or we see an article, like I'm all about that. I'm all about just quickly sending people things and being like, did you see this? Right. And it's just, effortless. And so that is probably one of the biggest issues with sexting, is that it can be shared. It can be shared even in situations where you think it won't be shared. So there's a lot of apps like Snapchat, I know, has a feature where you send something and it goes away, after a little bit, but it's not really gone. It's saved within, Snapchat's mainframes, and a lot of people can take screenshots. Now, I do love that an app like Snapchat tells you if somebody's taken the screenshot, and you might be able to say, hey, I see that you did this. I need you to delete that, or I need you to, make sure that you keep that just to yourself. And so there's a lot of trust and faith that you have to put into that person. So I think that with, sharing, there is the potential for all of a sudden victim blaming as well, because some people will say, well, you should have known better. Okay, maybe that's true, but how does that help? It's like kicking somebody who's already down. So no to victim blaming, but yes to helping them understand that there is a piece of responsibility and there are ways that they can take responsibility for their safety. So that is something that, we need to be aware of in terms of how we're talking about people. I really do think there is that distinction between blame and responsibility that we need to understand. So it seems that, unfortunately, right now, because of a lot of the ways that the laws are set up, which is not amazing. I will kind of preface that it's not amazing, and because of the way that they're set up right now, there's really few to no consequences for the people who are forwarding sex and who are using, or misusing texts and trying to exploit people. And so that's something that that's an area that really needs to be addressed absolutely within this topic. And resulting and it's not always the sending of the sharing of the sex that is the problem, it's the response to the people that get it afterwards. So, are people praising, or are they shaming you afterwards? So in cases where youth are sharing sex and forwarding them around, a lot of times people are using it in a way to, fuel gossip, to, ruin reputations, to make people feel just, like really horrible about themselves. Lots of slut shaming as well that might go on, especially in the cases of young women, sharing sex or sharing pictures of themselves. And what can happen is people feeling depressed, people feeling anxious, people feeling fearful or even suicidal as a result. So these are really the outcomes that we need to hone in on as well, because this is what we want to avoid. And the way that we can avoid those negative mental health outcomes is really by helping people understand what that those can be the result of their actions. And those actions, they have a choice. They have a choice to not engage in that type of behavior. And that's a big place for intervention to happen. So within the literature, there's a big divide in terms of looking at, girls and sexting, boys and sexting, very much a gender divide as well. And I would say that, this is an area that, very much keeping it within the gender binary, not totally helpful. So we know that there is definitely some literature, and I'll talk about on the next slide. There is literature looking, at the experience of sexting among the LGBTQ community, but we know that our understandings of sexuality and gender are ever expanding, ever growing, and sometimes the research is a little behind. Remember how I told you that researchers like categories? Yeah, it makes their lives easier. It just becomes a lot more simplified, because sometimes when they have to go into those nuances, it makes it a little bit harder to understand what the data is telling you, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done. So I think that there is something to be said there in terms of how the research is lacking. But there does seem to be a gender divide and a gender double standard, and if we're going into the binary here. So the experience of sexting for girls compared to boys on average seems to be quite different. So girls are a lot more likely to be asked to send sex. So whether that's, a message, or most often it's a picture. They often report feeling pressured or coerced into sexting, usually by individuals who they might actually like, people who they're trying to gain the attention of, they're trying to entice into wanting to date them or be sexual with them or to just like them. But the problem is, and this probably won't come to anybody as a surprise, understanding some of the sexual double standards that are out there in the world, girls are more likely to be labeled as sluts, for sending, but then if they don't send, they could be labeled as a prude. So we can't win. And so I think that understanding that the stakes are very different for these two groups on average. But that doesn't mean that sexting is all great for guys. It's not necessarily. There's so much of it that's wrapped up in their sexuality and their pressure to be sexual, their pressure to, from other friends to pressure other girls or other boys as well to engage in this behavior. Sometimes people put, this idea that engaging in the behavior is tied up to their masculinity as well. So again, they can't win either. And we should all be winning. I don't understand why anybody is losing. We should not be in this situation, but here we are. So again, I encourage you to think about, what are some of the ways that we can examine a lot of these issues further? What are some of the ways that we can address this? So you see that sexting, you can be looking at it on its own, but it's also a bigger part of comprehensive sex education as well. So the literature that is out there on the 2S LGBTQ community, limited, and I think that we can say that for a lot of, topics within sexuality and even not sexuality. So definitely a place for growth, place for more examination as well. But it seems to be that, there's a lot of similar reasons that they engage to people who are heterosexual. But there is some literature that says that, particularly among young gay men, they seem to be engaging in sexting more, and it seems to be a little bit more normalized as well. And accepted. But they're also, a lot of these individuals are more likely to experience online victimization for many reasons, but the sexting is definitely part of that as well. And I think that there's some, in terms of, their higher likelihood of being victimized online, some people think it's in relation to their sexuality, but others think it's just because they're actually online more. and they are engaging in these types of behaviors a lot more as well. So when you engage in a behavior more, overall, yes, you are more likely going to see higher rates of, different types of outcomes as well. And, being online is incredibly helpful. I was saying before, for some people, it's, allows them to be anonymous, or it allows them to feel more confident. It allows them to really feel safe and make them feel like they have a sense of agency and control over the situation as well. So being online definitely brings all of that to the table, but of course it has to be balanced with, understanding what are those potential risks and outcomes. And sexting within relationships, I mean, it is a big part of our sexual repertoire for a lot of people. It's quite normalized and expected. Sometimes it's unexpected. Sometimes you could just be chatting with your partner and all of a sudden it takes a little bit of a sexy turn. So it definitely is a way for people to engage in foreplay. So a lot of people, if you look at sex therapists or relationship therapists, they'll talk about setting the mood throughout the day. And a big way that people do that is through sexting, especially if you're at work. Maybe you shouldn't be doing that work, but people still do. So being able to, send your partner a sexy message saying like, I can't wait to see you when you get home, or I can't wait to be with you later. That is such a big part of keeping the spark and maintaining the spark and, building the spark, whatever phase you might be at within your relationship as well. And people will engage in this whether they're dating and like more casual and not committed. It could be a way to build anticipation, to build arousal, to build connection. And then people who are doing it within, more committed relationships, it can be a way to maintain that commitment, maintain that connection, and maintain the arousal as well. For people who are long distance, especially during the pandemic. Wow, I had done another presentation last year looking at the state of dating within the pandemic and relationships, and heard from so many people about and read about so many people who were separated from their partners because they were, either by geography or even just because they had to socially isolate from one another due to varying levels of risk. And, what does that leave you? If you can't be with your partner, in person, then you need to have other ways to communicate. So whether that's video chat or just, texting or messaging on various apps as well. There's definitely ways that people want to connect, and this is absolutely a way that people have been able to do that during the pandemic, for example. But even beyond the pandemic, when more and more people are engaging in long distance relationships, this is a way to keep that connection alive. Now I'm going to get into sexting and the law. Disclaimer, it's not great. There's tons of work that needs to be done in here. The laws are hardly equipped to deal with this landscape. What has been done or what has been used in different cases to date, some people will look at age of consent kind of rules. Some people will look at it in terms of child pornography. Others will look at it in terms of, private information. And then also there's the online criminal legislation as well, code. So there are these bits and pieces of laws and policies that were in place for other reasons that are now being applied to sexting. But they're hardly useful in a lot of ways. And in lots of ways, they can be used against people who, especially the victims themselves. So, so somebody, say, for example, a youth decides to send, a naked photo of themselves or sexually suggestive photo to somebody, and then that person ends up sharing it. That person, that youth who created it, sent it with the intent of, thinking nobody was going to see that except for the recipient. And then suddenly they're the person who ends up in trouble. Because like I said before, there aren't really clear laws in place to hold accountable the people that are sharing the information. It comes back to the people who then created that information. It's really unfair. It's very biased negatively towards the victims at this point. So yes, a lot of lawyers will try to be fancy with this because of the ambiguity that exists within this, and the fact that they kind of have to piecemeal. They need precedent, from other cases, and a lot of times those cases have used, one of these laws or a combination of them as well. But in the end, it's just an area that needs much more attention, and we need something that is very particular to the context or the landscape of sexting, particularly for youth. I think even there needs to be separate youth versus like more adult laws as well, because I think there are different considerations for those different groups as well. So I wish I had better information or news for you in terms of, how helpful this might be. And I think that there are ways that people can protect themselves with some of these laws, but there are ways that they'll be used against people too. So I think everybody needs to be aware of that. So in considering, what is sexting and the various ways that people might be looking at it, and when we consider the various consequences, or potential consequences that are, out there, whether they're good, whether they're bad, we need to consider. So how can we help youth as educators and caregivers? Well, the first thing we can do is just, attend webinars like this, get educated, understand the nuance to the issue, understand the, potential shortcomings of some of the laws that are out there, help people understand what are some of the ways that they can protect themselves. So not necessarily abstaining, but knowing that, you need to be making informed decisions. You need to know all of the potential outcomes and decide for yourself what makes the most sense. So if you're going to engage in this behavior, do it in ways where it's risk-free. So some of the other ways, comprehensive sex education. I mean, understanding that we can't just expect people to avoid engaging in this behavior, because again, it is such a common part of, our world at this point. So it's really not going away. And if we try to tell people, and we know this within just general sex education, when you try to stigmatize something and, prevent people from engaging in it, they're less likely to ask questions. They're less likely to seek help if something goes wrong. So we want them to come to us. We want them to say like, hey, I'm in trouble. I need your help. We don't want them to suffer alone. So I think that there are some other things that we can do, especially as caregivers. There absolutely are, more protective measures that you can put in place, so I know some people might use, different password protected features within smartphones or on computers as well. So I know that those are done with good intentions, but youth are smart. They will find ways around that. So I absolutely encourage conversation, and not knowing how to have those conversations, that's where our reports come in. Absolutely going to the environmental scan report. There are lots of great pamphlets and fact sheets and lesson plans out there that can help people understand how to have these conversations with youth in a way that is really, youth friendly as well. And when we think about things being youth friendly, we have to do it we have to think about what do they want. And we have to ask them. And so thankfully, there are some researchers out there who have asked youth, what do you want when it comes to sexting and when it comes to learning about it or talking about it with caregivers and educators. So they want to learn about it in school, but they also want to hear about it, in a very, positive way with their parents as well, to a degree. There's definitely going to be some kids who are just, they'd rather die than have that conversation with their parents. And same with some parents, they'd rather die than have that conversation with their kids. But, school is absolutely, we know that that is a very effective way, because we have a large group all at once have their attention. But the interesting thing that I found was that this one report talked about how the youth were not so much interested in those big assembly style lectures. They really wanted those more intimate, smaller classrooms. They also wanted somebody who was external to the school. So they want somebody who is, really, engaging, but they also want somebody kind of closer to the age, but not necessarily. It just needs to be somebody who is a little bit further removed. So not necessarily their teacher or their gym teacher or anything like that. So, so kind of considering that and thinking about, you know, in your community, who could you hire, who could you invite in to talk to youth about this, and you as educators, I mean, maybe you want to tackle this yourself. And that's where our reports come in again as well, because there are really great examples of full lesson plans that we have put together, or sorry, that we have pulled from the web and put together in our report as well. So please check that out if you are interested in providing this education yourself. So looking at the time, I would love to show you this video. So let's do that. It is about 15 minutes. So I'm going to make sure that this is all good and hopefully you can hear. Oh, there we go. No touching buttons.
Most people think that digital communication is worse communication. Of course, it changes the tone and content of what we say when we say it via a mobile phone or an email. There's examples such as people getting dumped by text message, or even worse, the online harassment that we see pretty much everywhere. There was Gamergate, where it started out as some articles about video games and turned into this mob mentality and even death threats about some video game articles. Digital media, of course, plays a role in these problems. John Suhler at Rider University in New Jersey coined the term the online disinhibition effect in 2004. What this refers to is the fact that when you're communicating online, you feel anonymous, you don't have that physical proximity to another person, and you lack eye contact. And this gives you this feeling of freedom to say things that you might not otherwise say. And for some people, that means they say really, really horrible things with that freedom. And this, of course, causes serious, serious problems in many cases. But what I want to talk to you about today is something different. It's about how those same features of online communication might help us think about consent in new and more productive ways. I'm an assistant professor of communication, and I've been researching sexting since the moral panic about it began in 2008. Sexting is using any form of digital communication, such as your mobile phone or an app or even an email, to send a sexual image or text message to another person. A review of studies by some researchers at Deakin University in Australia found that more than 50% of young adults are sexting. Some studies, it was even higher. Now, the rates are a little bit lower among older adults. However, according to an American Association of Retired Persons article in 2009, sexting is easy, fun, and usually harmless. And they recommended that retirees use sexting to bring some spice back into their sex lives. Yet, in researching my book, Sexting Panic, I found that despite some of this enthusiasm about sexting, overwhelmingly, the media coverage of sexting is negative. We hear a lot about suicides and bullying. We also hear about revenge porn. And this is a huge problem. It's really terrible when someone shares a private photo and that person betrays their trust and shares that photo around. The research on sexting is also overwhelmingly negative. Researchers are often looking for what's wrong with sexters, what would cause them to do such a thing. And so they try to find correlations to impulsivity or drinking or unprotected sex or attachment disorders. There was a meta-analysis by a researcher at Ilmenau University of Technology, and she found that 79% of the research about sexting was looking for a negative effect or some kind of an unfortunate consequence with sexting. So given all of that overwhelming negativity, I was really surprised during my research to come across, time and again, these online sexting tips articles that were actually talking about consent. I saw this so often, and I was so struck by it that I thought, I have to do a study on this. I have to figure this out. So I wanted to know, is there really advice about consent happening in these online sexting tips? And I was so intrigued by this question because there's two reasons, really. The first is there's so much sex advice in print magazines and online as well. And there's a ton of research on it going back decades that it's, unsurprisingly, really sexist usually. It's also usually really heteronormative. And in addition to that, you really shouldn't take their advice to use ice cubes during sex because pretty much no one likes that. The second reason is that activists have been telling us that we need affirmative consent for decades. People keep saying it over and over again, and people keep resisting it, saying, it's too complicated, it's not sexy, I don't understand what I'm supposed to do. They think that they can't really do it in their sex lives. And yet here we're seeing it. I found it in these spammy clickbait articles about sexting. I'm talking about sites like Gizmodo, WikiHow, Men's Health. These are not feminist websites, to say the least. They don't have an agenda of helping us understand consent better. It's there. So this tells us something really interesting, that affirmative consent doesn't have to be that complicated. It can be popular, it can be mainstream. And it's really quite simple. If you initiate a sex act, it is your responsibility to make sure that you can arrive at a mutual agreement about what's happening with the other person who's your partner. It's really as simple as saying, do you like this? And the answer you're looking for is not silence, it's not maybe, it's not something ambiguous. It's yes, I like it. That's it. It's that simple. And promoting this model is so important. There's a lot of theorists and researchers that have told us that the rates of sexual assault that we see that are high worldwide, this is not inevitable. This is a problem that we have the power to solve by changing our social norms. Unfortunately, we have a wide acceptance of sexual violence. There was a very disturbing study from researchers at the University of North Dakota, and they found that 1/3 of young men said they would force another person to have sex if they knew there were no consequences. Most of those young men did not admit that they would rape someone, but if you phrase it in that sneaky way, they say, yeah, I would do that. 1/3. I'm disturbed by that statistic every time I think about it. Most people who are likely to commit rape as well tend to believe in rape myths. There's many studies on this, and those myths include that victims are asking for it, or that men are supposed to follow these gendered scripts of aggression and force during sex. And so what we have is this typical sexual violence prevention that everyone's probably heard, where we tell potential victims, avoid all risk, as if that was possible, and say no more loudly and more clearly. And we tell people that this is the solution to sexual violence. If it was, we would have solved it because everyone's heard this before. It's not the solution because rape is not a problem of miscommunication. There's tons of research that shows that people are actually very good at understanding an implicit or ambiguous or nonverbal no. It's not that difficult. The problem is that rapists choose to ignore that message. The thing is, people who commit rape have this expectation sometimes in their head that force and aggression and coercion is just part of the script. And this is a very gendered thing that men are taught in so many different ways in our culture. So instead, it's so important that we work on changing our culture to make affirmative consent and talking about consent and practicing talking about consent the norm. This means that we have to teach everyone, including potential rapists, that they have to make sure that they've negotiated a meaningful yes with their partner. So this is why I was so excited to see consent in these online articles. So I did this study. and I took a sample of the web pages that users searching in English are likely to come across if they're looking online for either sex tips or sexting tips. And I just took the first page of Google search results for some really popular keywords, because nobody actually clicks past the first page of Google. And I came up with 41 unique websites from places like Cosmo.com, and there was a British sex ed site for teens, and there was also romanceways.com, which hasn't been updated in a very long time. My question is, how were these sex tips different from the sexting tips? Were they really discussing consent differently? Because I sort of thought they might be. Turns out they were. So 5% of the sex advice tips talked about consent, but 33% of the sexting tips did. And I was happy to see that difference. So those general sex tips, they hardly even talked about communication, which is vital during sex. They just kind of talked about communication as something that's fun to add, that might enhance your sex life, which it's a good start, but they're kind of implying that communication is optional, and it's not. A few even had these fantasies about sexual aggression, which is totally fine as role play, but there were no advice, there was no warnings about making those scenes of fantasy aggression, making sure that they are safe and consensual, and that's vital if you're engaging in that type of role play. The sexting tips, on the other hand, though they were not perfect, only 33%, not all of them, they point to something that maybe we're getting better at talking about consent when we're talking about sexting. Maybe we're headed in the right direction. These sexting tips, they did talk about this, communicate because it's fun, it adds something, but one-third of them warned about the potential harm of sending someone a sext that they don't want. This is so exciting because it tells readers, you need to seek consent before sexting, and that's just not there in the regular sex tips. So for example, one website said, make sure the other party is a willing participant. This doesn't seem that complicated, but this type of comment was really not in the sex advice at all. Even better, there was explicit warnings about the harm of unwanted sexting. So people described it as something that would cause shock and horror, or might make someone feel weird and uncomfortable and impossibly awkward. Sending unwanted sexts was called creepy, and people warned in these articles that it was a form of sexual harassment to send someone a sexual image that they don't want to receive. Another article said that sexting is like dumping out some giant bucket of condoms and sparklers. This is important because it's not just about having better sex. It's about, implicitly, you don't want to harm another person. You want to respect their sexual autonomy. And you want to engage in explicit communication about sex. Some of the articles even addressed the rape myth that prior sex acts or a prior sexual relationship implies consent in the future. One article says, just because a woman gives you her number doesn't mean she wants to sext. That's good advice. Another said, don't send unsolicited naked pics, ever, even if it's your wife. Also good advice. The biggest gender disparity is that men were told, don't send photos of your penises, and women were told, don't send photos of your faces. This is a curious disparity at first, but the more I thought about it, I think the reason is we're not really used to objectifying men's bodies. It happens sometimes, but not nearly as often as we objectify women's bodies. So the dick pic is seen, if it's unwanted, as maybe a joke. Some people do want to receive them, but that's why you ask for consent before you send it. Women's bodies we're used to seeing as sexual objects. So the risk for women is not that you might offend your partner or be rejected, though you should also get consent. But the risk in these articles is that you could be identifiable in these photos, so don't include your face. Now, in art and popular culture, women are constantly sexually objectified. We've all seen it every day. But we have this double standard where when we see women as active, desiring subjects who are sexually expressive, a lot of the time we shame and stigmatize those women. So women are asked to walk this very familiar and difficult sexual tightrope where they're encouraged to engage in sexting, but then shamed and blamed if someone distributes their private image without their permission. So it's great that the sexting tips are saying, get consent before you send an image. But what's missing in the sexting tips is they don't talk about the serious trauma and harm of distributing someone's private image without their permission. And I was really disappointed that this wasn't there at all, but then again, it's the internet, so. So as a new media researcher, my question is, what's technology doing here? Is there something about the technology that's leading us to see this commentary about consent? Again, these websites, I have to stress, are not part of a feminist movement. They're not part of some anti-rape organization. They really didn't seem to be there on purpose at all. So what I think is that this presence of consent in the sexting tips, I think it comes out of the way that digital communication alters the way we talk to each other. We have this general sex advice that it's always assuming that consent is implicit, that it's easy to figure out, that you don't have to talk about it. You do have to talk about it. But with texting, it means there's no physical proximity, there's no body language cues, there's no nonverbal feedback. And so you have those same features of digital communication that leads to this online disinhibition effect and causes all of this terrible bad behavior that we see online. But those exact same features mean that you can't assume consent. You have to talk about it. You can't take it for granted. And it can't be inferred. And this is so significant because it tells us that affirmative consent can be mainstream. It can be popular. It can even be clickbait. Now, I don't know if people actually follow this advice, but I did see a study from some psychologists at Drexel University that found that for some people, sexting was correlated with sexual and relationship satisfaction. So I think what's exciting about this is that digital communication might actually have the potential to teach us something about consent, that we can't take it for granted, it has to be explicit. And maybe sexting can help us practice talking about consent more. And maybe that can help us solve this genuine social problem and help us all talk about consent a lot more and in a lot better ways. Thank you.
All right, so I absolutely adore that woman, or that human. And yeah, they talked about so many, amazing interplays and relationships between sexting. And, I'm always looking at how can we get consent out there in the mainstream? How can we, help people understand it? And the fact that she put the two together, sexting and consent, sexting as a means for teaching about consent, incredible. I also came across the other day from Queer Sex Therapy, this whole idea about how to engage in sexting in a consensual way as well. So I wanted to include this in the presentation because I want you to have it. I want you to have it as a resource. Everything here we will share with you all after the presentation. So yes, consent is the key with sexting to avoid so many of the potential risks and pitfalls with it. And beyond that, there's the consent that happens at the beginning, but it has to be ongoing. The trust has to be ongoing as well, because again, those images, those texts, they can be forever. So yeah, generally, when we're talking to youth, but even when we're thinking for ourselves, what are some of the ways that we can, make sexting safe, and how can we make it, fun? And a big part of that, yes, consent, but also having conversations, setting the tone, setting the expectations, making sure that both or multiple parties are all on the same page. And there's definitely some technology features that we can make use of as well. And the technology is always changing. So I suspect that we're going to have to keep evolving with it as the technology evolves and make sure that we're using the most up-to-date features. I'll say even for myself, I just realized to my horror that sometimes Facebook changes your privacy settings. So I had people messaging me and I didn't realize that I had made some of my stuff inadvertently public when normally I try to keep it much more private. So that type of information, knowing that can really help a lot of people avoid, potential risks as well. So again, encourage you to take the slides once we share them with you, check out the webinar again after it's recorded and shared, and check out these resources. So again, the literature review, it's going to be a little bit more researchy, and I would question the accessibility of it in some ways, but we have also made the Prevention Institute has made a fact sheet summarizing some of the information from there as well that can be more readily shared. And then the environmental scan report, again, tons of really great tools and information. We didn't include all of the documents or fact sheets within there, but all the links are there, so you should be able to find them online for yourself. And whether you want to keep them for yourself or share them with others, please do. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. So we'll go through, some questions here in the chat. We might not be able to get to all of them, but I think you did cover some of the material that they're maybe asking for. So if that's not the case, please do email me afterward. I'll drop my email in the chat, and then I can link you with Lindsay if there's time or need for that. So first question from somebody in Manitoba. One of the things that often comes up in the discourse there is the concerns for Indigenous folks, both those living in urban settings and on First Nations, regarding sexting and sexual behavior online, and that it might be a risk factor in exploitation of Indigenous youth, particularly girls, women, and Two-Spirit youth. Is there anything in the evidence that educators should know about?
Oof. I wish. This was definitely an area that, especially because Savannah, in my other report looking at grooming, that was definitely something, because there's different levels of vulnerability for sure that we have to consider. And yeah, absolutely. Indigenous youth in different contexts can be quite vulnerable for various reasons. But yeah, this was a gap, major gap. And I wish that I could give you a more thorough answer for that, but there just wasn't, at least from the articles that I had, come into my sphere. So if anybody has anything around that, please do send. I would love to add that to the report and update it if possible. But from what I saw, like even doing intentional searches as well at different points, yeah, unfortunately didn't see that. But you're right. I think we do need to make sure that it's not just a blanket statement of youth. It needs to be, we do have to consider those vulnerable groups, which some researchers have when they talk about the gender differences or the sex differences, and when they talk about the sexual identity differences as well. There are going to be different levels of risk for sure.
Thank you. Next question, is there any scientific consideration for the state people are in when they're using screens as opposed to other forms of communication? For example, lack of different kinds of communication feedback, the stuck on stupid kind of state where they're looking at the screen for long periods, and what that might, or how that might influence their behavior, or misinterpreting or lacking tone, things like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, definitely. And I think that was something that was talked about within that video as well that I showed you, where she was talking about the online disinhibition effect, for example, as a way for people to, almost have a mask. They feel very protected and feel very brave when they're behind a screen. But if they ever met those people in person, they would never say what they say, in an online context. So absolutely. And again, I didn't dive too much into this because that is its own consideration if we're looking at just communication related research. But yeah, absolutely. I think that can definitely play a role in terms of how people take tone and take messages for sure. But again, it wasn't something that I had focused on, but such a great point that we do need to, make sure that people understand. So especially, if you are, I don't know, I think for example, like if you tell somebody that you're not interested and they're not really getting it, and I've experienced that myself, right? And I'm just like, why do I have to spell this out for you? Don't make me do this. But yeah, so I think such a great point, and definitely areas that are important within this context.
Perfect. There are a few questions. I'm going to try and combine them into one, but do you have any thoughts about maybe firm boundaries around sexting, particularly maybe younger people or people who've engaged in problematic sexting? How would banning them from that practice or taking away their data maybe impact that situation?
Yeah, to me, that goes too far into the maybe deviant side of like perspective of things. And, in the more abstinent side of things, again, youth are sneaky. They will find ways, so keep that in mind in some ways. But there's also, they want to engage in this behavior in a lot of ways too, because there are those good parts of it. And then I was saying too, that there are parents who will try to put that, those password protections and parental controls on it. Those are all viable and reasonable options, except that, if you are going to engage in that, I would also suggest having conversations with them and trying to understand where they're coming from, because if we just try to ban it kind of makes it more enticing. So I don't know about whether or not I would personally promote banning, but I do promote having conversations with you so that they can make very informed decisions and totally understand what are the potential risks to their behavior.
Perfect. I think that kind of links or leads up or even covers some of the next couple of questions, but do you have any examples of school policy around sexting that maybe are good or bad or things to avoid, as well as good examples of curriculum? I know the resource that you created with the environmental scan has a lot of different.
Yeah. I'm thinking even to the literature review document also, we also touched on some of the policy that schools can engage in. A lot of times schools only really care about themselves. They're just caring about their bottom line. They want to make sure that they don't get in trouble. So a lot of times the policies are really geared towards that, like protecting the school itself, protecting the administrators and the teachers. But I think we need to care about the youth too. So policies that are focused on youth and focusing on, again, bringing comprehensive sex education in, including a discussion about sexting, and listening to what the youth want, how they want it. So I gave you some, examples of that within this presentation. That does come up in the reports also, because they're the ones consuming the information. Like, why not give it to them in a way that actually makes sense and that they can relate to? It's going to be much more likely for them to take it up if it's done that way.
Perfect. So what do you think are the barriers to having these conversations and creating these spaces for youth to talk about sexting or sex in general? This questioner can't help but think of some of the ideologically driven morals evident in policies, practices, and programming where youth are too innocent to be engaging in sex, drugs, etc., and abstinence is instead promoted. And they say fab presentation, by the way.
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, like there is going to be, as I said, like there is that dual perspective. There's lots of perspectives of it, but those two main ones, yeah, if you are going to take a more moral approach to it, that usually does correlate with different types of, behaviors that are more abstinence. But we know the research evidence does not support that way of engaging with youth and explaining sex education to them, and that includes sexting. So I would say that the research does not support going into this, abstinence, cutting them off approach. We know it doesn't work. So I would say let's move away from that when we can. But again, I get it. Like, I mean, I'm not a parent myself, but I can, in talking to friends who have been, dealing with their teenagers, getting into, wanting to engage in this. Oh my God, my dream is coming true because they're all coming to me now and asking what to do with their kids. So I love it, but I can't make those hard decisions for them. All I can do is put it all on the table and encourage them to have an open and frank conversation with their kids. And if they can't, then encourage the schools, encourage the teachers, find resources that are geared towards youth and give them to them. Those are also included within the environmental scan. There are youth-friendly resources that we did put together as well. So if you can't have the conversations, let somebody else do that for you. Some other people have put that work in. They have created amazing documents that, make it so that youth don't feel so attacked or like they have to protect themselves or that they should be scared. Because I mean, do we really want them walking around thinking that they're going to be in trouble all the time. You know, I don't know about that, but they do need to understand the risks, but they need to know that this is still a way or there is still a way for them to engage in that behavior in a safe way.
Absolutely. I think related to that, when do you think these conversations should start happening? And maybe they're not going to be explicitly about sexting, but how can we begin those questions about, or those conversations about consent, about sharing, you know, sexual material or having any kind of online.
You want to do, yeah, I mean, there's so much like out there that'll tell you, you know, oh, do it this age, do it that age. I would say that it's going to be an ongoing conversation, and it should begin when you're both able to. And I'm thinking, you know, if you're doing it one-on-one, right? If you are talking to somebody and they are not open to learning, you're not getting through to them. So they need to be open to learning. And there's different ways that you can do that. One of the best ways is to make somebody feel safe and that they can trust you and feel like that there's no judgment in terms of if they have different perspective from you, or if they have, you know, questions that they might think are weird, right? So I think, you know, gauge when they're ready, engage when you're ready, because you don't want to go into a conversation and feel unprepared, feel caught off guard, feel like you don't have a place to turn for answers if you don't personally have the answers as well. I would say that the conversations need to be, you know, tailored to the age groups, because you can't have the same conversation across, you know, for each age group. It's not going to be relevant at every age. Sometimes they might not be mature enough to understand or to want to think about that as well. So they need to be very age appropriate and ongoing. And when everybody is able to really listen and absorb and be ready to, you know, apply that information.
Perfect. Well, I think those are the main questions that we have. Oh, nope, there's one that just popped in. What else can I say to my youth who are engaging in sexting with absolute strangers?
Ooh, okay. Well, I can't wait for the grooming report to come out that I just finished as well. So yeah, sexting with strangers, huge alarms in a lot of ways. And it's not necessarily that it's going to end badly, it just has the potential. And again, that's where they need to understand what are the potential risks with that. Why, and you know, and who is that stranger? Is that a stranger who is a peer, or is that an adult, right? Is that somebody who is an adult posing as a peer, as a youth? Sometimes you don't know. And that's part of the scary thing about online, is that people can hide themselves. If anybody or not even just hide themselves, they can be in plain sight and still fool you. If anybody has watched The Tinder Swindler, oh my God, on Netflix. I think I started it and I had to turn it off. It was too much, but that is the reality. And I think just letting kids know, letting youth know that that is the reality, not in a way that they avoid it, not in a way that they're scared of the world, but in a way that they can feel armed with what they need to protect themselves too. And to feel like, remember at the beginning, I said, you want them to come and talk to you. You want them to tell you when they're in trouble. And this is a prime example of where you do not want them to be silent and feel like they can't tell you what's going on, because there are pretty serious risks if that person is malicious and trying to groom them or exploit them in different ways.
Absolutely. We will have that report. I added in the chat, but the report on grooming for the purposes of manipulation and exploitation will be released before the end of March. So stay tuned for that. We'll be sharing that really soon.
Awesome.
Oh, we just have so many questions. I'm probably going to only answer a couple more so we can finish up. But I saw this was asked a couple of times. Is it effective to limit general screen time for kids of different age groups? And you know, how would that limitation potentially impact their behaviors?
It's not the screen time that's the problem. It's how they're engaging in sexting, right? And if you engage in sexting without knowing, you're just like, yeah, I'm going to send a picture with my full face and all these identifying features. Oh, I'm going to put my phone number. Oh, I'm going to put my email in there. You know, if you're giving people all of that away, that's where you can get in trouble, because some people want to use it against you. And so people youth need to understand that it's not, and I think parents need to understand this too. It's not the quantity, it's the quality of it.
Absolutely. What do you think people who support youth, what can they say to the youth who are actually forwarding those sets or sharing them?
That's a really tough one because, again, they don't really get it. They don't always see that something's wrong, and especially when it's not happening to them. They can't, youth are just by design, because of their brains aren't developed yet. They're very egocentric, right? They really think about themselves. Their empathy isn't always developed yet. Empathy is hard, though. Empathy is a really tough thing to teach people, because you expect that people can really put themselves effectively into somebody else's shoes, and we can't always do that. So I always say compassion. Teach compassion. Teach the fact, just let them understand that to be a good human means not doing something that could hurt somebody else. So it's not just about, it goes beyond just talking about sexting. It talks about being a good human as well. And that includes, just if you can't understand from somebody else's perspective because you've never been in that place, then you need to just let them understand that if they want to be a good person, that's what this behavior means. When you don't forward, or if you forward with permission, because again, some people like that. Some people they want to be a little exhibitionist, and share, and they get something out of it, because again, like, there are some people that I've talked to who say that they feel good about themselves. They want people to see. So I think just understanding where they're coming from and their reasons for doing things is important too.
Perfect. I think we have one final question here that we're going to get to before wrapping it up. So someone asks that while they agree that adolescents should know consequences, especially for certain risk behaviors, but how do we safely, I guess, communicate the fact that part of their development stage disregards consequences?
I know that's see, this is where you need a developmental psychologist to come in, because that is absolutely something that has to be a part of this, right? And so that's why, like, just giving youth all how to about sexting and the safety around it doesn't do enough, because you do need to focus on the fact that it might not be developmentally appropriate. It might not be said in a way that they understand. And that's where, maybe having them hear from somebody who is a peer, who has lived it, part of within the resource package. I think it's within the environmental scan. There are some videos that we've included that talk about youth's experiences of having, been violated in different ways because of sexting. So I think being able to show people something like that can be really helpful, because maybe it's something that's a little bit more relatable because it's coming from somebody that's their age, that's lived it, that is telling you the real world consequences. Equivalent to, I remember in high school and getting those assemblies where they would have somebody who had been in a drunk driving accident, right? It's similar, where so much more powerful when you're hearing from the people with the lived experience. Can't just be the researchers, can't just be the teachers. It has to come from the people who have lived and breathed it as well.
Absolutely. I see in the chat as well, Erica's mentioned that using a harm reduction approach can be really important in this situation. So letting them know the risks, but also letting them know how they can do things safely, so that when they do engage in that behavior, they know how to protect themselves or avoid potential negative outcomes.
No, exactly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that incredible presentation. There's a lot of amazing feedback in the chat. I will share all of this in an upcoming follow-up email in the next few business days. So that includes the slides, that includes a recording for this presentation, as well as files for the chat, so that anyone interested can kind of look back. Maybe someone commented something that you wanted to review. So thank you again, Lindsay. Is there anything that you'd like to share before I finish up?
Oh gosh, wear your masks, wash your hands. No, that's it. Go hug your dog, go hug your cat, go hug your loved ones. I'm gonna go hug Steve. He did so good. He didn't interrupt once, so.
Well behaved, Steve. So when you close this window, you'll be directed to a link where you can complete a short survey evaluation of this session. Completing evaluations really helps us create programming and resources that supports you in the work that you do in the community. So we appreciate the time that it takes to complete them. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll talk soon, I guess.
Good. Bye,
Take care.
everyone.
Bye.